So for natural selection to work, number one, individual organisms that make up a population, they have to vary in traits. So there has to be something called phenotypic variation. And phenotype is just what an organism looks like. So there has to be variation in the phenotypic traits that an organism or a population of organisms have. Number two, differences in traits. So this phenotypic variation, these traits that vary within a population need to be heritable. In other words, they need to be passed on from one generation to the next, from parent to offspring. And they've since figured out that there's a genetic basis for these traits. So DNA is how traits can be passed from a parent to an offspring, from one organism to another. That is the way that traits are passed on, or how heritability works. So there has to be a genetic basis for a trait so that it can be passed on from one generation to the next. And the third things are sort of a two-part, or there's two parts to the third sort of requirement for natural selection. Number one, more offspring need to be produced than can reproduce in subsequent generations. And the second part of this is those that do end up reproducing are not a random sample from the population, but in fact they have adaptations. And for this course, we have a very specific definition of adaptations. These are heritable traits that increase an organism's fitness. Okay, so an adaptation is defined as a heritable trait, so it can be passed from parent to offspring, and that trait specifically enhances an organism's fitness, or the amount of offspring that it produces in the next generation. And so for natural selection to occur, individuals with certain heritable traits, or these adaptations, they actually produce more offspring. And when we say produce more offspring, that's what we're talking about when I use the word fitness. So when I'm talking about fitness anywhere within the context of natural selection, I'm not talking about, you know, your cardiovascular fitness, how ripped you are, how muscular you are. When we talk about fitness in the context of evolution, natural selection, we're talking about the number of offspring that you produce and the number of those offspring that go on to reproduce themselves. So natural selection occurs when individuals with certain heritable traits or adaptations produce more offspring than individuals that don't have those traits. They don't have those adaptations. Okay, so I've read you all this stuff. I expect you to sort of retain this stuff, but it makes a lot more sense if we look at it in a concrete example. And I want to reiterate, make sure you know these definitions, specifically adaptation, specifically fitness. Make sure you know the adaptations to those two terms. I'm sorry, the adaptations, the definitions to those two terms. So let's look at a sort of more concrete example. This is a very simplified example. And this first sort of requirement for natural selection is that individual organisms in a population vary in traits. So when we're talking about a population, the technical definition of a population are individuals of the same species living in the same area at the same time. So we're looking at one species and all the individuals of that species that live in one place at one time. That's a population. So here we're looking at the population of dots in Blueville, this place. Okay, so just real quick, type into the chat, what trait do dots, or these dot organisms, or this dot species vary in? What's the trait, if you're looking at it, what trait do they vary in? Yeah, everybody's blowing it up. Color, that's right. So there's variation in the color of these individuals. So that's the first requirement, is there's variation, and you'll see why that's important in a couple slides here. So there's variation in trait. The second requirement is that traits are heritable. In other words, they're coded in DNA so they can be passed from parent to offspring. So if we look at Blueville and we look at a purple dot and we look at the first generation and then the second generation, you can see that purple individuals give birth to purple offspring, blue individuals give birth to blue offspring, red individuals give birth to red offspring. So in this case, that trait that varies, color, is a heritable trait in the sense that it's passed on from the parent to the offspring. And we can assume in this case that it's coded in the DNA of these dot organisms in Blueville. So requirement one, variation, check. Requirement two, those traits are heritable, check. We've got both of those requirements. So the third requirement is that individuals with certain heritable traits produce more offspring than individuals without those traits. Okay, so let's introduce, so we've got the first generation reproducing happily to make the second generation. This is the second generation sitting around in Blueville, happily doing their thing. And then a selective pressure is introduced. In this case, a predator comes along. So the predator comes in, and this is a visual predator, and it eats up individuals in Blueville based on which ones stand out the most in that blue background. And as a result, all the purple and red individuals get eaten because they're just easier to see in this environment. And so those blue individuals are sort of like the Arnold Schwarzeneggers of the population. They blend in really well with their environment. They're able to hide from the predator and survive. And so in this second generation after predation, it's just the blue individuals that are left in the population. They've survived. And so when they go on to reproduce in the third generation, now there's only blue individuals left in the population. So they'll reproduce individuals. And in that third generation, after that selective pressure has been introduced, specifically that predator has been introduced, you've got now all the blue dots, okay? And so in this case, you've got individuals with heritable traits, that blue color, producing more offspring than individuals without those traits. So the blue individuals are producing more offspring in that next generation after that selection or that selective pressure comes into the population. Okay, so a couple important take-homes from this sort of natural selection scenario where we've selected for blue individuals in the population. Number one, individuals, not populations, are naturally selected, okay? So you don't have selection. The predator is not selecting at the level of the population. The predator is selecting individuals. It's eating purple individuals. It's eating red individuals. So natural selection is occurring to individuals. But populations, not individuals, evolve, okay? So no purple dots have turned into blue dots. No red dots have turned into blue dots. Instead, the composition overall of the population has changed, where there's now a higher proportion of blue individuals left in the population than those other colors. So you don't have the individual dots sort of evolving themselves or changing. You have a sort of selective sweep where you're removing certain individuals and leaving other individuals that have that advantageous trait or adaptation. So it's a population that's evolving or changing, not individuals, okay? So we've gone from a quarter of blue individuals in the population to 100% blue individuals in the population.